On the afternoon of January 25, 1787, roughly 1,500 armed men marched on a hilltop arsenal above the Connecticut River. They were not a foreign army. They were farmers from western Massachusetts, many of them veterans of the Revolutionary War that had ended barely 4 years earlier. And they were led by a former Continental Army captain named Daniel Shays. They wanted the 7,000 muskets and 1,300 barrels of gunpowder stored inside, and they intended to use them to march on Boston. Waiting for them was a state militia of about 1,200 men under General William Shepherd, and when Shays' column advanced past the point of warning shots, Shepherd gave the order to fire the artillery directly into the crowd. 4 men fell dead, 20 more wounded, and the rest scattered into the snow. The uprising that became known as Shays' Rebellion collapsed within weeks, but the fright it gave the country's leadership, the realization that the young United States had no reliable way to defend a federal arsenal against its own citizens, let alone a foreign power, became one of the direct arguments for scrapping the weak Articles of Confederation and writing the Constitution that replaced them. The institution this story is about had not yet built a single rifle. It had already, indirectly, helped write the founding document of the country it would spend the next 181 years arming. This is the story of Springfield Armory, the first national armory of the United States, founded on the personal orders of George Washington, the birthplace of interchangeable parts manufacturing, and, by extension, of American mass production itself, the factory that put a rifle in the hands of American soldiers in every conflict from the War of 1812 to Vietnam, and the government institution that was finally shut down not by an enemy, not by a scandal, but by a Secretary of Defense with a stopwatch and a spreadsheet, on the theory that the private sector could simply do the job cheaper. Every week we tell the stories of the engineers, the factories, and the decisions that built or destroyed the world's most important firearms companies. Subscribe if that kind of history interests you. There's a new one every week. The site was chosen in 1777, in the middle of the Revolutionary War, when General Washington and his chief of artillery, Henry Knox, needed a secure place inland to store muskets and gun carriages, safely out of reach of British naval power along the coast. Springfield, Massachusetts, sat on high ground above the Connecticut River, far enough from tidewater to be defensible, close enough to the river to move supplies. It began life as a depot, a warehouse for weapons already made elsewhere. In 1794, with the Constitution barely 5 years old, and the country having just weathered the very rebellion described above, Washington authorized it to begin manufacturing muskets outright, alongside a sister armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The reasoning was blunt and strategic. An independent nation that relied on foreign arms manufacturers for its own self-defense was not fully independent. Everything the country's soldiers would carry for the next century and 3/4 would, at least in part, trace its lineage back to that 1794 decision. The problem the armory was built to solve was not, at first, a problem of design. It was a problem of scale and consistency. Firearms in the 18th century were built one at a time by individual craftsmen, with parts hand-fitted to each specific weapon, which meant that if a soldier's musket broke in the field, there was no guarantee a replacement part from another rifle would fit it at all. Springfield Armory became the proving ground for the solution. Interchangeable parts, machined to such precise and repeatable tolerances that any part from any rifle of the same pattern would fit any other. The Armory's engineers, men like Thomas Blanchard, whose 1819 lathe could duplicate irregularly shaped wooden gun stocks by tracing a master pattern, cutting what had previously required a skilled hand carver down to a mechanical process that could turn out a dozen stocks at a time, did not just build rifles. They built the machine tools and manufacturing philosophy that the rest of American industry would spend the following century borrowing. Sewing machines, bicycles, typewriters, and eventually automobiles were assembled using production techniques that traced directly back to a government rifle factory on a hill in Massachusetts. Through the 19th century, the Armory's output tracked the country's wars almost like a heartbeat. The Springfield rifled musket armed Union soldiers through the Civil War, with production scaling from a peacetime trickle to hundreds of thousands of weapons a year almost overnight. The armory employed some of the first female industrial workers in the country during that surge, decades before it became common practice elsewhere. The single-shot trapdoor Springfield carried soldiers through the Indian Wars of the following decades. And then, at the turn of the 20th century, the armory ran directly into the same rival that this channel has already told the story of once before. During the Spanish-American War, American troops discovered they were badly outgunned by the Spanish Army's Mauser rifles, faster to reload, flatter shooting, more modern in every respect than anything Springfield had in inventory. The Ordnance Department's answer was the Model 1903 Springfield, and it borrowed so heavily from Mauser's bolt design and stripper clip system that when the German company's lawyers reviewed the new American rifle, they found 7 separate patent infringements. Rather than fight a lawsuit it was almost certain to lose, the United States government quietly agreed to pay Mauser 75 cents in royalties for every M1903 rifle produced, and 50 cents for every 1,000 stripper clips, up to a ceiling of $200,000, a debt the U.S. Treasury paid off in full by 1909, to the very German rifle-making firm America had gone to war partly because of. A second German claim, over the shape of the pointed Spitzer bullet adopted for the .36 cartridge, dragged on until the United States entered the First World War in 1917 and simply seized the enemy patents outright, only for a federal court to rule in 1920 that the government owed the original claimant's estate over $400,000 anyway. The nation's flagship rifle factory had built its signature weapon on borrowed engineering and paid for the privilege twice. The armory's genuine, unborrowed masterpiece came a generation later, and it came from an unlikely source, a French-Canadian farm boy. John Garand was born on New Year's Day, 1888, in the small town of Saint-Remy, Quebec, and moved with his family to Connecticut as a child, where he learned the machinists' trade in the textile mills that dominated the region. He drifted through precision tool shops in Providence and New York, designed a machine gun that the Army rejected during the First World War, and parlayed the attempt into a government job, first with the National Bureau of Standards, then, starting in 1919, at Springfield Armory itself, with instructions to design a semi-automatic rifle that could replace the bolt-action M1903. He became a U.S. citizen in 1920, the same year he took the civil service salary that would define the rest of his career, $3,500 a year to start. It took him roughly 17 years, working through a bureaucracy that changed its own specifications more than once along the way. The rifle's original .276 caliber was scrapped late in development at General Douglas MacArthur's personal insistence, in favor of reusing existing .30-06 ammunition stocks, forcing Garand to substantially redesign a nearly finished weapon before the M1 Garand was formally adopted in 1936. General George Patton would later call it the greatest battle implement ever devised. More than 6.5 million were built before production ended. Garand received not 1 cent of royalty for any of it. As a federal employee, he signed over every patent related to the rifle to the U.S. government in January 1936, and by every account did so willingly, apparently satisfied that his engineer's salary, which had climbed to $8,000 a year by the early 1940s, was compensation enough. A bill was introduced in Congress to award him a one-time payment of $100,000 in recognition of what his invention had meant for the country. It failed to pass. He kept working at the armory on experimental designs until his retirement in 1953, remained a familiar, quiet presence around Springfield for the rest of his life, and died in the same city in February 1974, the very year a private company 3 states away would purchase the rights to keep his old employer's name alive on a product line that had nothing to do with anything he ever built. The armory's fortunes after the Second World War followed a wartime peak that no institution, public or private, could sustain in peacetime. Employment and production, which had swelled to meet the demands of 2 global wars and Korea, scaled sharply back once each conflict ended. The Armory developed a successor to the Garand, the M14, adopted in 1959, a rifle that was, on paper, a reasonable evolutionary step. A Garand action modified for a detachable magazine and full automatic fire, chambered for the new NATO standard 7.62mm round. In practice, it became the weapon that ended the institution that built it. The M14 program ran years behind schedule and dramatically over its projected cost, was plagued by design issues that made the rifle difficult to control in automatic fire and prone to losing its accuracy after a few thousand rounds. And, when outside auditors finally checked the quality of rifles coming off Springfield's own production line in the 1960s, found that close to 40% of a sampled batch should have been rejected on inspection. None of this was hidden from Washington. It landed instead directly on the desk of a new Secretary of Defense who had built his entire reputation on exactly this kind of problem. Robert McNamara arrived at the Pentagon in 1961 from the presidency of the Ford Motor Company, bringing with him a management philosophy built on cost-benefit analysis and systems efficiency, an approach his critics nicknamed, not always fondly, the reign of the whiz kids. In November 1964, after a 20-month review of the entire U.S. arsenal system, McNamara announced a sweeping restructuring, and Springfield Armory's closure was part of it. The government, he argued, no longer needed to maintain and staff a permanent national rifle factory, when private contractors could design and manufacture small arms competitively, scaling production up in wartime and down in peacetime, without carrying the fixed overhead of a standing government workforce during the years in between. The final blow arrived when the military selected the M16, a rifle designed by Eugene Stoner at Armalite and manufactured under contract by Colt, as the successor to the troubled M14, cutting Springfield out of its own replacement program entirely. With no new rifle contract, no clear mission, and a Secretary of Defense who had already spent 2 decades in the automobile industry treating factories as line items to be optimized or closed, the Armory's future was no longer a design question. It was an accounting one. On April 30th, 1968, after 174 years of continuous operation, the flag over Springfield Armory was lowered for the last time. 4 local police officers fired a 20-round salute using M14 rifles, the very weapon whose troubled development had done as much as any single decision to end the institution that built it. Some of the buildings became a state technical college. The rest, in 1978, reopened as a National Historic Site under the National Park Service, preserving the largest collection of American military small arms in the world inside the same brick walls where those weapons had been designed and built. In 1974, a family named Reese purchased the rights to the Springfield Armory name and launched a private firearms company under it, first in Texas, later relocated to Illinois, with no manufacturing or institutional connection to the government arsenal whatsoever, beyond a trademark and a shared address in history. The John Garand, who had refused nothing but a royalty check, died that same year, in the same small city, close enough to both events that a person could have read about them in the same week's newspaper, without ever suspecting they were connected. There is a particular kind of ending reserved for institutions rather than companies, and Springfield Armories is a clean example of it. Nobody out-engineered the government arsenal. No rival factory built a better Garand or stole its customers. The place that trained the country's earliest machinists, built the tools that built American industry, and equipped every American war from the founding of the Republic through the jungles of Vietnam, was not defeated. It was audited. A man with a stopwatch decided the balance sheet no longer justified keeping the lights on, and 174 years of continuous operation ended the way most bureaucratic decisions end, quietly, on a cold morning, with a flag lowered and a fired salute nobody in the crowd seemed to notice was more than a little ironic. The country that could not afford to import its weapons in 1794 decided, in 1968, that it could no longer afford to make its own.